You can set it right there. I have yep, everybody can hear me. I am mic'd up. Perfect. So I think we should be able to get the presentation on screen here in just a moment. But as that's getting loaded up, just to, again, share a bit about myself. My full-time job, probably would be a husband and father, which the father part takes up more than I would love, but it does. So I have a 6-year-old. And then I'm a pastor at Westway Methodist Church in Los Angeles, California. The congregation, we have 2 separate worshiping communities, one in Sanctuary, one in what's called the Loft, which is what I lead. I might say a little bit more about that as we get going, but I preface by saying that, the things I'm going to talk about today, I think sometimes what comes up at these kinds of events are people think about, well, how can I preach that in my church or this won't preach? I am giving you these things as a framework for thinking about how we talk about Jesus through the lens of preaching, but also just knowing that this is what I do every Sunday. So this is not a kind of abstract theory. This is grounded in lived and practiced theology, which I think is important in terms of what I think a seminary like MTSO is called to do. And I guess I want to begin by maybe even stating the obvious. Now, we know we are living in an age of empire. I think that we can look at let's just talk about what's happening in America. How many of you would say that things have changed since the election of Donald Trump and him being in office? Raise your hand. Yep. Things have changed. How we live, the world we're in, how we engage with each other, how we engage in different communities have changed. Now, we all can accept that as fact. So then the question I think we have to then wrestle with for those of us who are religious leaders, and the question I want to pose to you all, is how has your church changed? How has your preaching changed? How has the way in which you engage your community changed? If you can agree that everything has changed, that the world we're in has changed as a consequence, right, of this election, and yet you haven't made changes to what you are doing in your church, to an extent, what you are saying is that some part of this is normal, or you are normalizing what is happening. This is I say this not to condemn, right, but more to awaken and inspire the reality of the situation that we are in, right? The reality of the situation that we are in. And I, too, had to have someone say this exact question to me to help me realize the situation I was confronted with. And I also have to say, too, I know things are, especially if you are in the Ohio area, it's different here than the church I'm in Los Angeles. By this, I don't mean just demographically, but because what really instituted a change within my community and how we're engaging what's happening now was the deployment of ICE and the abduction of people from our community. I don't know if you are familiar or aware that they actually went into a United Methodist church about 30 miles from my church and had their guns out during when they were having their community garden, they're selling their produce. Families were there, kids were there and everything, and they ran on the campus to arrest the man. It was terrible. And I can't imagine the kind of traumatic experience that this would have, not only on everybody, but particularly the children that were present when this happened. So this is my reality. So that is a part of the reason why I think that's a helpful question for us to wrestle with. So the question that I think we have to ask ourselves in terms of thinking about our preaching is drawn from the Good Samaritan. I want to pull on this, and I'm going to pull some threads from our earlier sermon today as well. In terms of thinking about who is my neighbor. Who is my neighbor? When we're talking about preaching in an age of empire, it is about making explicit who has been included, who has been excluded, right? And actually confronting the logics that create those boundaries right, around each other. So, as we can see, Luke 10, a legal scholar stood up to test Jesus and said, "Teacher, what must I do to gain eternal life?" Jesus replied, "What is written in the law? How do you interpret it?" He responded, "You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your being, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." Jesus said to him, "You have answered correctly. Do this and you will live." So it comes across as though, obviously, this legal expert, this lawyer, knew the right answer. However, he goes on to say in verse 29, right, to prove that he was right. The legal expert wanted to prove that the assumptions he was taking into the conversation with Jesus were right. So we already know the posture with which he's trying to learn is not one of openness, not one of actually acceptance. Rather, it's coming with a posture of challenge to say, well, I think the way I'm living already is good. It's in alignment with what we're supposed to be doing, but I want to hear it from you. And I think the tension that we see wrestling, that is evident in this text, is the tension between ego and perfection, right? The way in which you have certain religious communities, we can speak to just Christians right now, but religious communities that are so invested in maintaining their own egoic structure, meaning centering themselves in what they do to justify themselves as doing things in the right way, that it's always been done this way, that you can be resistant and recalcitrant to change. Whereas I think what Jesus shows us in his spiritual path, in the religion of Jesus, is what we in the Methodist Church call perfection, sanctification, or you can look at it as stages of faith, right? How do we grow in Christian maturity? I love how Richard Ward describes it as falling upward, right? A way in which we really have to descend internally to then know what it feels like to have a deeper relationship with ourselves and the sacred. And so this is what I think Jesus is inviting us to do in this particular context of empire that I think is helpful for us in our current moment. And so let's continue to unpack this. And then my plan is to have y'all have some breakout conversations in groups and then have people share and stuff like that. And I'll get to that in just a moment. So Jesus tells a story. He replied, "A man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho. He encountered thieves who stripped him naked, beat him up, and left him near death. Now it just so happened that a priest was also going down the same road. When he saw the injured man, he crossed over to the other side of the road and went on his way. Likewise, a Levite came by that spot, saw the injured man, and crossed over to the other side of the road and went on his way." So the question that we're supposed to ask ourselves that I think is relevant for us is, why didn't these two religious people, these two people who are among those set aside and practiced in the religious beliefs of this community, right? Why didn't they help, right? And so we know, or what should be implicit in this text that we will make explicit, is that ancient Israel was a society structured around preserving boundaries between different people groups. These boundaries were theologically and socio-politically justified. These boundaries are often situated around notions of purity, which we'll talk about in a moment, but also around men separating themselves from women and children. Why is Jesus always talking about including women and children, right? Their boundaries are separated around different kinds of classes. All these things are set up to distinguish people against others. And so, what we see happening in this story is a priest and a Levite who do not want to help this person because of purity codes. Because this person could be dead, and if they touch this person, then they will have to go through a process of ritual purification, right? That's what's implicit in this text. Around this is this notion of theological anthropology, right? What does it mean for us to see other folk as full human beings? Human rights begins at your definition of human. When you see someone as somewhat less than human, and you may not explicitly say this, but when you see them as less than human, then you are open to the idea that somehow they don't have the same rights as you do. right? Whether you're talking about legal rights in terms of representation in court, legal rights in terms of their legal quote unquote status, or the kind of rights that they have to actually stand in front of someone and actually preach, right? This is what we talk about with theological anthropology. It's a standard by which we create and maintain social, political, and ecological boundaries. Theological anthropology is about the God-human, human-human, and human-non-human nature relationship. And this is what Jesus is troubling in this story. And so the first questions that I want y'all to talk about, just find a few people around you. I would say you want to be at least a group of 3. What are your core beliefs, right? What core beliefs guide your theological beliefs about and ethical actions towards human beings, right? What are the core beliefs, your core beliefs, that guide your actions? If you need to write them down, you don't do it now, but I'm gonna have you in your groups. You need to talk and then write this down. Why are those your beliefs, and what is the source of that claim, right? So those 3 questions as a way to kind of start us not only unpacking this text, but then to think about what it means for us to apply these questions to the overall arc of how we preach in the age of empire. So let's, we have about 5 minutes to talk about these questions, and then we will take a little brief conversation and go to the next couple of points. So you have just about 1 minute left. About 1 minute left. All right, everybody. Yeah, there's one up here. Thank you. All right, everybody. I'm going to ask someone, at least one person, to share. I want you all to know that this is what I like to call the trust tree. So there is no blame, shame, or judgment on any of your answers. This is more about us collectively having a conversation, but there's nothing you're going to say unless you say that you theologically justify dehumanization that I would disagree with. Other than that, we should be okay. So, it's about actually cultivating conversations and help us actually construct these things together. So, who wants to share maybe their thoughts about questions 1, 2, and 3? Yeah. Here, I have a microphone right here. That way people in the online can hear what you're saying.
Oh.
So just speak into the microphone when you're sharing.
Okay, you want one of our answers?
Yes.
Our answers, well, one answer is
And you can speak to yourself. You don't have to name the group unless you want to. That's totally fine. It's up to you.
Is the core belief is to give to institutions like the church and credible institutions that is what they intend to do, that we support them.
Okay. About supporting institutions?
Supporting, we care for others.
Generosity. Oh, okay. Yeah, now it makes perfect sense. Thank you. Like the importance of having a virtue of generosity and practicing that as a kind of core belief, as we should not only theological belief, but ethical belief in terms of how we act towards human beings. Anybody else they want to share about their, all right. And feel free if you can answer all three if you want to. That's totally fine. But just,
Probably not.
Okay.
But we had talked about loving others.
Yes.
And loving them as they are. But the struggle is when they don't respect others.
Yes.
It's hard to love them. It's hard to show them that respect if they're demeaning to everyone around them.
Yeah.
But God doesn't put here's an exception clause for you.
Yeah. I mean, this is what we talk about grace, right? In the ways in which, like, we can't put boundaries around who has access to grace or love, in part because we don't want those boundaries placed upon us, right? We don't want those boundaries placed upon us, and how we think about that. And loving our neighbors is not always the most default or easiest response, right? But there's a distinction between loving your neighbor and saying that everything they do is correct or right? That's not it. Like, loving your neighbor does not mean you agree with everything they say. Loving your neighbor means that you agree to not dehumanize them or to morally justify hating them, right? Because hate begets hate. Like, when you allow hate inside, hate will eventually eat you alive. You will begin to normalize hate, and ultimately you will hate yourself, right? That's the way hate works. It filters through everything. And so this is, I think, one of the aspects that Jesus is talking about within this particular story. Not to say that, again, that love is easy, but it is critical. Well, actually, I want to say, never mind. Love is easy. The hard part is actually making space to understand the distinction between loving your neighbor and also holding them accountable as a practice of love, right? Also making sure that there's a process for reparations and repair when trust has been broken, right? Like, what do you do? It's not just saying I forgive you. There has to be a process by which, right, you actually repair the relationship. And so in this sense, much of what Jesus talks about is normalizing repair, right? Think about that. How many of us grew up in households or relationships where perhaps, our family or adults did something wrong? We can look at it and say this was wrong, but they, for whatever reason, didn't feel as though they needed to apologize because of their authority over you. So what happens when that, what happens, right? When you realize this, you begin in turn to practice this when you become an adult. That depending on the power and situation I have, I don't have to actually repair the harm that has been done. But when we normalize repair, we make space for healing to take place. When you don't actually repair, nothing is healed. So, these three questions, the reason why I asked them, your core beliefs guide your actions. Do you believe human beings are created in the image of God? As a core belief, right? Do you believe that they have inherent dignity? Do you believe that they are all should be treated equal? Do you believe people should have equal access to certain goods? Like, all these things are around your core beliefs. Your core theological beliefs then guide your ethical actions, right? If you believe this as a theological belief, you have to then apply it consistently from an ethical perspective. So if you believe that all people are created in the image of God, what does that mean for how you then act out your ethics? You cannot choose to, you should not, I say you can't, you should not choose to take your normative values and only apply them in contexts that benefit you or that benefit people in your group. If it's a norm, it's applied consistently, right? Let me give you a microphone to make sure that people can catch the comment.
It's actually a question.
Oh, okay.
It relates to the equality, because equality to me doesn't always mean the same. And I think that sometimes that's often how it's interpreted. I have a special needs daughter, and one of the drawings you often see are these three people looking over the fence.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
When you look on the other side of the fence, they're all on a different size stool. They have equal access, but
the distinction between equality and equity. I think that's really important, right? That among these, as we're talking about this, people do have different needs to make sure they can participate faithfully. Do you give them what they need to participate faithfully? And so much of what we're saying, because we're almost jumping to the end by these comments. No, that's a great question. I say that to say, I think these things are so explicit in the Gospels. And this is the season by which we are actually engaging these texts in the Bible through Jesus' life. And it's our opportunity, right, to not only plant these seeds, but to till the land so that these kinds of questions, people can begin to answer. The answers will be made more explicit. I think one of the challenges I think we can have as pastors is people will often say, or can say, oh, what you're saying is political. Oh, you're talking about politics, and there should be something different about, that. And what I want to suggest, first of all, I guess two things. The Bible is both personal and political, right? It's about our relationship to God as persons, right? And what does that mean for us to be pulled towards this divine lure of love? But it is also political. It starts in the Exodus, the Mosaic covenant, where God liberates God's people. That is a political action. Then they go and form community. They create laws that govern them. That is a political action. So to say, if you're preaching the Bible, it should be personal and political, or you aren't preaching the Bible. Right? Like, that's just there. People don't, and so that's what I say when someone's here talking about politics, because it's there. It's there, right? So, the sources of your claim, I think, are also critical. And by that, I mean the claims have to be grounded in the text, in my opinion. You have to ground these claims both in Scripture And personally, I will prioritize, put that in conversation with tradition, reason, and experience in the ways we normally do that. But that source where you draw from ought to be grounded, I would argue, in the teachings of Jesus. And so I'll get to more about that in a moment. So why didn't the priests and Levites stop to help? What caused them to step aside socially, one might say? What I want to suggest is that one of the challenges we have that we see going as far back as this story, but also being played out today, is the way in which we talk about what it means to be human, and that we create a subhuman other. So much of the language we use is around a subhuman other, right? Listen to the way in which you hear our current administration talking about Iranians. Listen to the way people that we are at war with and how we talk about them. That's when you start hearing the logics and languages of animalization and dehumanization disguised as patriotism. Right. And so this, because of the nature of Christianity post-Constantine, it's normal within Christian thought. And so we've adopted what I would call in the West currently a kind of false binary between human nature and men and women. And colonization expanded this binary to include race and class. And so the problem, if we say, right, in terms of our anthropologies, right, how we actually understand each other as humans, is a limited development of neighborly love as the default Christian response to other forms of life has been the adoption of a way of being human that is filtered through the projection of white Christian imagination that normalizes the exploitation of life for its own sake. Now, I put white in quotations because I knew there are going to be a lot of white people here, and I want to explain what that means. White in this sense is not talking about white people. I'm talking about whiteness as a logic, as a organizing principle and force, right? None of you were born white, but all of you who are white and all of us who are not white learn what it means to practice whiteness. To practice whiteness. Whiteness isn't genetic, but we know how to practice it because this is a particular kind of trauma for everybody, right? Race, in the way we've done racialization and constructed, is traumatic. Because in order for those of you who are white to be here, you had to come from, you had to be delinked from your land. You were German, you were French, you were English, you were Spanish. And the way you understood yourself and situated yourself was tied to those lands and that landscapes. And for you to then get that removed, right, you are no longer tied to the land. Your self-understanding is tied to your flesh, right? Literally, your flesh becomes the new landscape by which you organize yourself. That is a kind of trauma that still lingers within white folks when they say, I don't have a culture. When you hear that, that's that trauma. You have a culture. You have to do the work to plumb the depths, to find out and to remember and to connect to that land. If you don't do that, you cannot heal. That song you were humming, like those are the songs. Like the songs of your people, they're in you. You got to connect to those songs. That's the beginnings of actually understanding and separating and liberating yourself from the logic of whiteness as such, right? And so this is what I mean when I'm talking about understanding racialization as a trauma for everybody. And unfortunately, that has filtered in the ways in which we practice being human. The way we understand and define what it means to be human is often about performance, right? It's performance. Do you do certain things? Do you speak certain ways? Do you have certain religious rituals? Rather than merely being alive, right? And so what we have to do is come up with a new and develop a new anthropology that I would argue says being human as praxis. That's a fancy way of talking about sanctification. It's really a fancy way of saying it is a practical application of, for us, the religion of Jesus in the way we practice being human. So this requires both learning and unlearning, right? Learning and learn, because there's things we have to unlearn in order to grow, right? So how did we get here? A lot of this is because of the legacies of colonialism, where we both cheapened non-human nature, right, to justify exploitation. the modern notion of society has historically a unique antonym, nature. And so you're either part of society, you're a part of nature. You're either a human fit for society, or you're a savage fit for the wild, right? That's a language that often came up during colonization. Importantly, once those boundaries have been created, they are policed. And they are policed often with violence to make sure that people know what side and what space they're supposed to be in, right? This kind of cheapening is what ends up moralizing the ways in which we treat our planet and all of our resources, because we don't give them proximate value, right? We don't act, well, I don't want to say that just yet. I'm getting ahead of myself. That's a big part. The second part is we cheapen life, right? And this is where I think I'm going to offer a critique to, the folks in my guild who would call themselves liberation theologians, right? It doesn't do enough to just critique people who call other folks, people like myself, who have, people have called people who look like me less than human, because to then argue and just say, well, I am human, actually doesn't do enough work. Because you can't be human in the same ways in which the notion and definitions of human have been practiced upon you. To be human like that is to legitimize what has happened. Rather, the invitation, right, is to actually redefine what it means to be human and to practice being human. Because so much of our understandings right now are rooted in a kind of xenophobia and ecological oppression, right? The way we think about the distinction between human beings and nature have normalized that. So we have to reimagine that. And so this is, I believe, the implicit theological anthropology that most of us were taught. We're implicitly taught and socialized to accept a normative structure of nature that places humans as the pinnacle, right? We read the creation narratives and we say, oh, we have dominion. For some reason we start, we take Genesis 1 and we just maybe skip over Genesis 2, right? Where it talks about being created from and with the earth, right? And how that relationship grounds us, right, as a farming people, right, within this broad epic poem of creation, right? So the racial formation ensures that human being is understood to be white. Patriarchy ensures that he is male. Heterosexism and ableism ensures that he is straight and able-bodied. All these are normative assumptions when people talk about being human. So when I asked you to identify your core beliefs around being human, that's what I was trying to get at, right? So often when people use the word American or human, all those other markers that I identified are just implicit. They're not explicitly stated, right? And so what I want us to bring light to are the ways in which these things can be embodied within us, because we've been taught to think this way. Again, not to blame or shame, but to understand this is what we were taught. And we know this to be true because the writers of the Declaration of Independence, they write these things, or the Bill of Rights, like all men are created equal. Well, obviously not, because you can't write something like that while you're enslaving people, right? Unless you are saying they're actually not all created equal. You can't write something like that and not allow women to own property or women to vote, right? You can't write things like that and then actually not tend to children that are born with disabilities. So it's implicit. And so what I want to suggest is that we have to, again, develop a new way of understanding what it means to be human that actually is inclusive and liberatory. And I do think this is what we find in these parables. Now, the theological tension that we have to wrestle with are that notion of sin, impurity that I talked about with respect to those priests and Levite who stepped aside. Within ancient Israelite culture, impurity was contagious and thus had social consequences. This is why they had rituals to purify themselves. To be associated with impure people was to be impure yourself, right? And so this was one of the strongest critiques of Jesus, that they always said, he's eating all the time, he's hanging out with prostitutes and tax collectors, and he is living a life that is ritually impure. Why should we trust him? Like, this is why the people critiquing Jesus saying over and over, because all Jesus did was hang out with quote-unquote impure people, right? And so because of this notion of impurity, I want to pause here and kind of have the same thing we just did before, about another 5 minutes. I think contemporary Christianity has been more concerned with managing sin, rather than developing a theology of sin that is useful for influencing how we practice Christianity, right? Remember, the initial question is, what does he have to do, right? This lawyer is trying to justify himself. What does he have to do to be in alignment with Jesus' teaching, Jesus' way of life? So it's very much around what constitutes sin. And so I want to spend, and I know most of you, most of us, unless you come from a denomination that tends to be more Baptist-costal, don't be talking about sin. We often don't talk about sin, right? But what I wanted, the invitation after today is going to be, actually, we need to talk a lot more about sin, but we need to do it in a different way, right? A different way. So let's spend a few minutes in conversation, answering questions 1 and 2. I'm going to start my timer so I don't go over time. So 5 minutes, and then I'll ask a few people, probably just one person, to share so I don't go over time. So we can start right now. All right, everybody, you got just about another minute, just another minute. All right, everybody. Similarly to the last conversation, I'm curious as to what came up for you in your conversations. Does anybody want to talk about how they define sin? I changed question two a little bit because I realized it wasn't quite getting what I wanted us to get to in terms of not only how your understanding of sin impacts how you interact with people, but also the policies and programs that you would advocate for, right? Like, how does your notion of sin, do you think, impact the kinds of things you would advocate for the creation of, like from a policy or justice-oriented perspective? You don't have to answer question two unless you want to, but I definitely would like to hear some people talk about question one. Does anybody have anything they want to share? Yeah. Let me give you the microphone, just so the people online can hear what you have to say. Andy.
Yeah. I define it as that which is counter to or contrary to God's dream or God's vision for human life and human society. So that's on the personal level, and then societal level. It's also, when I was a student here, one of the classes talked about in the Wesleyan vision of sin as a sickness, or sin as a disease, or a broken bone, or something in personally up to societally, something that is not as it should be, that can be fixed.
Yeah.
But is not
as it should be. No, I love that. No, thank you. That's that's very helpful. Thank you. Yes.
Since I was told I have to.
Shannon. Okay, Shannon, you have to share. You have to share, Shannon.
I have to share now. We discussed sin as a state of disconnection, and not just disconnect between a person and God, but between each of us. That individuals can cause disconnection, and that the structures in which we live and move can also create and exacerbate disconnections.
No, I love that. I love that. Both of these are great answers. And I think both of them really get to much of the language and the way we think about sin. But again, as I said, we can sit here in this room and talk about it, but we're often nervous about bringing it up in our sermons, right? We're often nervous about bringing it up in our sermons. I just realized I want to ask you this question. Why? Why do you think you're nervous? Why do you think some pastors are, if you aren't, to talk about sin in our sermons? To name and talk about sin, to name something as sinful and talk about it. Yeah, let me give you Carl.
I think those of us who work with a lot of queer people understand how beaten up they've been by the terms over the years, and so it needs a lot of work of redefinition. But before you can even get to that work, you almost have to get over the word itself if it's been used to batter people.
100%. I think that's very, very helpful, because the way sin has been weaponized to harm people. In the same way, I think the way we define being human has been weaponized to harm people. But we often don't make that same leap. But I want to say you're right? It's the way in which we've talked about sin and how it has been used, not as a tool, right? Or as a way in which we might actually help each other grow closer to God, rather a way of sin management, right? That's about trying to make sure people get to heaven. It's how we often think about, don't sin so you can get to heaven, right? So it's just this transactional nature. But again, this is not what we see in the Gospels. What I want to suggest is a different way of thinking about sin that may help us be able to have those conversations with groups and communities where sin language has done a lot of harm, right? I think another reason why people don't talk about sin is because, us pastors don't want to get in front of anybody and talk about things that we think may make them sad or feel as though they are disconnected, as we talked about, from the sacred. And so the way in which we think about sin theologically feels as though it can pull people away if they are self-reflective in terms of how sin is influencing or shaping their life. And so we see this passage in Mark. It's what comes out of a person that contaminates someone in God's sight. He said, it's from the inside, from the human heart, that evil thoughts come. Sexual sins, thefts, murders, adultery, greed, evil actions, deceit, unrestrained immorality, envy, insults, arrogance, and foolishness. The opposites of the fruit of the Spirit. All these evil things come from inside and contaminate the person in God's sight. Jesus is having this conversation around eating and ritual purity, right? And what Jesus is saying, it's not about washing these utensils to make sure that they're pure. It's what comes out of a person, not what comes into a person. The same logic that will be applied later on in Acts when Peter has his vision around kashrut and keeping kosher, right? So Jesus is drawing a distinction between moral purity and ritual purity and arguing that moral purity is the most important, right? Ritual purity is maintenance of ritual practice, right, for a particular kind of sake. Perhaps at some point that ritual held its weight and gave people a particular kind of connection to the sacred. But that can't be, we can lose sight of the fact that it's designed for a moral purpose. Again, you think about Isaiah and in chapter 1 talking about or speaking, prophesying through God, saying, I don't care about your sacrifices. They mean nothing, right? It's what you actually is in your heart that I care about. And so Jesus is critiquing religious forms versus the religion. And all too often we can get wrapped up in maintaining the forms rather than focus on what's the purpose, what's underneath this. What is it that we're trying to move towards? This notion, right, of morality. And so in the Gospels, Jesus, I think, sin, with the way Jesus talks about sin, is attributed not to obvious wrongdoers, but rather to those who do not bother to love. I think a more helpful definition, and I get this, I forgot to put their names on this slide, I apologize, from these Roman Catholic, Jesuit, those are my favorite Catholics, Jesuit priests who define sin as a failure to bother to love. And we see this most explicitly in the parable of the Good Samaritan. It's a failure to bother to love. I thought the definitions actually are perfect because I think they still encapsulate that. But I think when we talk about not bothering to love, it gets at the essence of what Jesus is actually making sure he brings to light in this conversation with the lawyer, right? They could have helped. The priest and the Levite could have helped, but they didn't bother. They did not bother to help. They could not take time out of their day or take time to make sure they went through a purification process to bother to love, right? In Scripture, sin resides not so much in our weakness, but in our strengths, meaning they had all opportunities to do something and they chose not to do that. There is often little more effort where we are strong. The story of sin, like the call to repentance, concerns those areas of our lives where we could have tried harder, precisely because we were able. Christ judged not the weak heart that struggles, but rather the strong heart that does not bother. Where are we not bothering? In those spaces in our lives where we think we're already doing good or great, however we want to frame it. I use great there intentionally, right? Where we feel strong in our lives are the places where we're unlikely to think we need God's mercy, so we may not examine it, right, with respect to our room and opportunity for growth. And so I think thinking about sin in a way that talks about not bothering to love captures the essence of what Jesus is suggesting and is a way that's invitational for us to name and call out structural sin when we see it, right? We can talk about the lack of universal health care as structural sin because it's denying people access to the things that we know they need to have a flourishing life, to mend the broken bones, right? Things that we know, if you know the history of why we don't have that in the country, I'll give you a quick hint, it's racism. You can begin to call this out, right? You can begin to identify the inequalities that we see in our society as a failure to bother to love the widow, the orphan, the immigrant, the other, right? Because we morally justified not loving them by saying that, well, they aren't human. So if we don't, or they're less human. So our lack of love for them doesn't really matter in the same ways. So what do we do? What's the solution? Go and do likewise. A Samaritan who was on a journey came down where the man was. When he saw him, he was moved with compassion. The Samaritan went to him and bandaged his wounds, tending them with oil and wine. Then he placed the wounded man on his own donkey, took him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day, he took 2 full days' worth of wages and gave him to the innkeeper and said, "Take care of him. When I return, I will pay you back for any additional costs." What do you think? Which one of these 3 was a neighbor? The legal experts said the one who demonstrated mercy. Jesus told him, go and do likewise, right? To literally go and do likewise, to demonstrate mercy, to be like a Samaritan, which from this person's worldview was telling him to literally do something that he could not functionally get his head around because Samaritans were the other. He was telling him the other, this other. That's more in alignment with the gospel that I'm inviting you to. And so going to likewise, the way I understand it, is you saw compassion in there, right? The Samaritan is a practical example of what it looks like to practice the religion of Jesus. Because the religion of Jesus is a spiritual path of radical compassion. It is a spiritual path of radical compassion. Because empires survive through numbness. Empires survive through collective numbness. We get numb to suffering. So they want you to be numb to poverty, be numb to homelessness, be numb to the cost of wars, be numb to the environmental degradation, be numb to all of that so you don't feel it. Because if you choose to feel, you might be activated to do something about it. And so Jesus' teachings, when he does his work, these acts of compassion, what he is saying is that what you are witnessing is not normal. Right? That dehumanization is not normal. It's compassion as critique, right? Compassion as critique of a system that has normalized suffering. He's saying, no, that your humanity and your human dignity matters. That's why I'm offering you compassion, so I can help us not feel numb to the suffering that's been placed upon us in the institutions that justify and moralize this suffering. I think in this sense, we see from Jesus' engagement with others that his anthropology was that all human beings and creaturely life is good. And we sin when we fail to bother to love and respect this goodness. Why do I say good? I think, again, all too often when we talk about sin, we go to Adam and Eve, and we go to the story of the fall. And we say, and have this implicit belief that doesn't reflect anything else in the conversation we have with sin, that says somehow sin is inherited. Now, none of us think that our sins are passed down to our children, but somehow in this story, this notion of original sin has made it explicit, so we think sin is inherited. Rather than starting at Genesis 1, where it says everything is good. There's something fundamental about all of God's creation that is infused, right? With life that is good. And if we remember that goodness and use that as the starting point for our anthropologies, then it reframes how we engage each other and God's creation, because we know at its core there is something in there that is divine, that it has that divine thumbprint on there, and it is good. And then when we fail to love that which God has deemed good, we are sinning. This, I think, is a way in which we can begin to resist and preach in an age of empire, right? Because when we do that, when we ground our sermons, right, by teaching anthropologies that are Christ-centered, right, that talk about the goodness, that we develop a theology of sin that fosters spiritual growth, because you're encouraging people rather to have and get lost in guilt and shame of things I've done or broke these rules. No, where can I love more? Where can I step into the flow of love more? It's an invitation to love, right? And when you do that, this explicitly critiques Christian nationalism because it goes against the logics of domination they have created that is all about creating boundaries to God and God's love. And the bonus is you do it using the gospel narratives. You don't have to add anything else. You just preach what Jesus said. And you know what? It resists empire because Jesus was preaching to resist empire. And I think when we center that, and particularly are careful about the anthropology that we bring to the text and the theology of sin, we build a framework for people so that they can engage these more political questions in a more theologically informed way. And that is our goal, is to train our congregations to do so. So I went slightly over, but it is 3 o'clock. And so I know I need to end. If you have any questions, please feel free. You can come up. I wanted to take a Q&A, but we ran out of time, so I apologize. But if you have any questions, feel free to come and talk, and I'll be up here for a few minutes before we get to our lecture. So thank you.